The wind was a blade, sharp with ice and carrying the scent of snow that hadn't yet fallen but surely would before dawn. It tore at the thin, threadbare coat of the figure huddled against the meager shelter of an overhang rock face. Inside the layers of rough, ill-fitting men's clothes, Elias shivered, teeth chattering not just from the cold that seeped into bone marrow, but from a fear that had been a constant companion for weeks. Food was gone. Water, iced over in the small canteen hours ago, was useless. The horse had given out days before. A mercy after the ribs had begun to show like macabre corduroy. Now, the only thing left was the staggering, desperate walk, a blind stumble across indifferent land under a sky the color of bruised iron. Elias had tried to make a fire, but the tinder was damp, fingers too numb and clumsy to coax a spark from flint. The cold was winning, creeping into limbs, promising a quiet, white surrender. The thought was almost appealing, a soft counterpoint to the raw ache of hunger and the gnawing terror of being found. Found out. Panic, a cold, wet thing, would sometimes seize Elias, a sudden urge to scream or run blindly into the desolate landscape. But exhaustion was a heavier master, pressing down, demanding stillness. The sound that finally reached through the haze of misery was faint at first, easily mistaken for the wind's howl. Then it grew, the rhythmic thud of hooves on frozen earth. Elias froze, every muscle tensing, mind screaming contradictory commands. Hide, beg, run. There was nowhere to hide that the wind wouldn't betray. Running was impossible. Elias sank lower against the rock, trying to melt into the gray stone, wishing the earth would swallow the small, shivering form whole. The sound drew closer, a single rider. A man. On this land, men meant questions. They meant suspicion. They meant discovery. The horse was large, dark against the fading light, steam pluming from its nostrils. The rider was equally dark, a shape silhouetted against the weak horizon, broad-shouldered, hat low. He pulled the horse to a stop some distance away, scanning the landscape, eyes sharp even from afar. Elias held still, barely breathing. If he saw, he saw. The horse began to walk slowly towards the rock. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. A trapped bird. There was nowhere to go. No fight left. The rider dismounted, his movements economical, wary. He was tall, lean, dressed in buckskin and wool, clothes practical for the harsh country, worn but clean. He approached cautiously, hands not on weapons, but held slightly away from his sides. His face was obscured by the low brim of his hat, but Elias could feel the weight of his gaze. He stopped a few feet away, looking down at the huddled figure. Silence stretched, thick with cold and unspoken questions. Elias couldn't lift his head, couldn't meet his eyes. Shame, exposure, fear, they locked the muscles tight. The man spoke, his voice low, rough like worn leather, but without immediate threat. "Boy, you lost." The single word was an effort, raw against a throat that felt scraped raw by thirst and fear.
Y-yes asiber braque de Elías.
The man knelt slowly, movements deliberate. He reached out a gloved hand, hesitant, then withdrew it. He seemed to be studying the figure, the thin frame, the desperate clinging to the inadequate coat. He didn't immediately press for details, for names, for where Elias had come from. He just knelt there, a quiet, imposing presence against the growing dusk. Elias risked a quick glance upwards. The man's face was weathered, lined, the eyes under the hat brim sharp and assessing. But there was something else there, too fleeting to name. Not kindness, not exactly. More like a recognition of a state, a fundamental understanding of being alone and exposed to the elements. He finally spoke again, his voice softer this time, edged with a weary practicality that suggested he'd seen hardship before. "You'll freeze here before morning. My place ain't far. If you can ride." Elias didn't know if he could ride, if he could even stand. But the alternative was certain death. He tried to nod, a small, jerky movement. The man rose, turning towards his horse. "Come on, then. Let's see if we can get some warmth in you before the snow hits." He didn't offer a hand, didn't pry. He simply offered a path, a temporary reprieve, leaving the choice, however stark, to Elias. The sheer weight of the cold was a powerful persuasion. With a monumental effort, Elias pushed up, joints screaming in protest, and began to stumble towards the dark shape of the horse and the man who waited, a silent, imposing figure in the fading light. The ride was a blur of bone-jarring jolts and the constant battle against slipping from the horse's broad back. The man rode ahead, silent, setting a steady pace. Elias clung to the saddle horn, focusing only on staying mounted, on the rhythmic sway of the animal beneath him. The cold seemed less biting now, perhaps shielded slightly by the horse's body heat, or perhaps the sheer will to survive had overridden the physical pain. The man's cabin was small, squat against the brutal landscape, looking less like a dwelling and more like it had grown from the rocks themselves. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a thin, gray thread promising warmth. Dismounting was awkward, a graceless slide to the frozen ground that sent pain shooting up Elias's legs. The man was there, not offering support but watching with that same quiet assessment. He led the horse towards a small corral, his movement sufficient. "Go on in." Fires going, his voice was low, a simple instruction. Elias shuffled towards the cabin door, each step an agony. Pushing it open revealed a single room, small but clean, dominated by a large stone hearth where a fire crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows. The air inside was thick with the smell of wood smoke and something else, faint but undeniably food. It was a stark contrast to the biting emptiness of the outside world, and for a moment Elias just stood there, letting the waves of warmth wash over him, a physical relief so profound it brought a tremor to his chin. The man came in behind him, closing the door against the relentless wind. He went to a corner, taking off his gloves and hat, revealing a face that was sharp-boned, eyes a pale, unsettling blue that seemed to miss nothing. He looked older up close, the lines around his eyes and mouth etched deep by sun and hardship. He didn't look at Elias directly, but his awareness was palpable. He went to a pot simmering over the fire and stirred it. The aroma intensified. "Stew." "Sit by the fire," he said, his voice still low. Elias obeyed, sinking onto a rough-hewn stool near the hearth, holding out numb hands towards the flames. The man ladled stew into a metal bowl and placed it on a small table near Elias. Another bowl appeared, along with a chunk of dark bread. "Eat." He didn't sit with him, but went to a workbench against one wall, beginning to oil a saddle. The silence returned, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic creak of leather as the man worked. Elias ate slowly, the food a revelation, warmth spreading through his starved body. Each bite was a small victory against the cold and the hunger. The man didn't look over, didn't ask questions, just continued his work, a silent, imposing presence in the small space. It was unnerving, this lack of interrogation, this quiet acceptance of a stranger in his home. It made Elias wonder what he knew or suspected. When the bowl was empty, a dull ache replacing the sharp pangs of hunger, Elias still didn't know what to do. Sleep felt impossible with this man here, but staying awake felt equally perilous. The man finished with the saddle, hung it up, and turned. He looked at Elias then, directly, those pale eyes searching. Elias felt exposed, the rough clothes suddenly inadequate as a disguise. The man's gaze lingered for a moment, then shifted. He went to a cot against the wall opposite the workbench. "You can take the bunk. I'll sleep here." He gestured to a bedroll near the fire. It wasn't an offer, it was a statement of fact. He didn't wait for a response, simply began to prepare his own sleeping spot. The cot seemed impossibly soft and inviting. Hesitantly, Elias stood, the rough wool scratching against skin not used to such coarse fabric. He walked to the cot, the man still not looking directly at him, giving the illusion of privacy in the single room. Elias lay down, fully clothed, pulling the thin blanket over himself. It offered little warmth compared to the fire, but the knowledge of a solid roof overhead, of walls against the wind, was a comfort beyond measure. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every shift of the man's weight by the fire, sent a jolt of anxiety through Elias. He waited for the questions, for the accusation, for the moment the man would see through the disguise. But the man remained silent, a dark shape by the fire, until eventually, exhaustion claimed Elias. The last thing he registered was the steady, quiet sound of the man's breathing, a surprising anchor in the vast, terrifying silence of the prairie night. Days blurred into a routine dictated by the harsh demands of the land and the man's quiet schedule. He was Silas. He didn't offer his name, not with words, but Elias heard him called at once by a solitary rider who stopped by for a brief, tense exchange before riding on. Silas didn't talk much. His world was one of actions. He milked the single cow, tended to the few horses, mended fences, checked traps he'd set far out on the prairie. Elias, recovering strength slowly, tried to be useful. At first, movements were clumsy, weak. Silas watched, saying nothing, his pale eyes observing every fumbled chore, every tremor of weakness. He didn't offer praise or criticism. He simply existed, a constant, silent presence. Elias learned to chop wood, hands blistering and aching, but the work was grounding, a focus away from the gnawing fear. He fetched water from the frozen creek, breaking the ice with a heavy axe, hands growing numb despite the thick gloves Silas had wordlessly provided. Silas never referred to Elias as boy again. He used no name at all when addressing him directly, preferring simple instructions. Wood, water, eat. It was as if the initial designation had served its purpose and was now unnecessary. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sounds of their work, the wind, the creaking cabin. Elias's internal monologue, however, was a constant torrent. Does he know? When will he say something? What will he do? The fear hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. It was no longer the raw, immediate terror of discovery in the wilderness, but a simmering anxiety about the inevitable moment Silas would acknowledge what Elias knew he must suspect, or perhaps already knew with certainty. Silas's eyes missed nothing. He saw the way Elias flinched at loud noises, the careful way he moved, the slender build beneath the ill-fitting clothes. There was a bandage Silas had given him for a deep cut on his hand, acquired fumbling with firewood. Silas had tended it himself, his large hands surprisingly gentle, but his gaze had been sharp, lingering for a moment too long on the wrist, the slender bones. One evening, huddled by the fire while Silas worked on a bridle, Elias finally risked a question, voice barely above a whisper. Why did you help me?" Silas didn't look up immediately. The creak of leather continued. The silence hung in the air. Elias regretted asking, wished he could pull the words back. Then Silas stopped working. He looked into the fire, his profile etched against the flickering light. "You would have died," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Nobody should die like that, alone." In the cold, it wasn't an act of charity, he seemed to imply, but a simple, grim necessity, a basic rule of survival on the prairie. He didn't elaborate. He didn't ask why Elias was alone, why he was dressed as he was. He simply returned to his work, the brief moment of explanation over. Elias began to notice small things. Silas leaving extra food within easy reach. His seemingly random appearances when Elias was struggling with a particularly heavy task, taking over without a word. The way he always slept between Elias's cot and the door. It wasn't protection offered explicitly, but woven into the fabric of their silent cohabitation. Elias started to relax, just a fraction. The constant tension in his shoulders eased. He still didn't talk about his past, couldn't bring himself to shatter the fragile, unspoken truce they had found. But the crushing weight of absolute loneliness had lifted, replaced by a quiet, shared existence. He began to see Silas not just as a potential threat, but as a man shaped by this harsh world, stoic and reserved, but with an unexpected undercurrent of something. It wasn't warmth, not in the conventional sense, but a deep, quiet understanding of the brutal realities of life and death, and perhaps a quiet defiance against letting the land claim everything. The fear hadn't gone, but something else was growing alongside it. a tentative sense of safety, and perhaps a sliver of something akin to trust. The winter deepened, fierce and unforgiving. Snow fell thick and fast, blanketing the landscape in white, isolating the cabin further. Supplies dwindled. The cold was a constant enemy, seeping through walls and bones. Silas and Elias worked together out of necessity, silent partners in survival. Chopping enough wood, melting snow for water, rationing their dwindling stores of dried meat and beans. Elias, gaining strength now, could keep up with Silas in many tasks, his smaller size sometimes an advantage in tight spaces. He was no longer just a burden, but a contributor to their survival. This shared struggle forged a different kind of bond, one built on mutual reliance and unspoken respect. Silas, observing Elias's growing competence and resilience, seemed to soften, almost imperceptibly. His gaze held less assessment, more a quiet acknowledgement. He still didn't speak much, but the silence between them was no longer heavy with unspoken questions, but companionable, filled with the sounds of shared work and the howl of the wind outside. One morning, a wolf, gaunt and desperate, came too close to the cabin. Silas went out, rifle in hand. Elias watched from the window, heart pounding. The shot echoed, a sharp report in the still air. Silas returned minutes later, dragging the carcass. His face was grim. "Food," was all he said, but the necessity, the stark reality of their situation, hung heavy in the air. That night they ate wolf meat, tough and gamey, but sustenance nonetheless. Elias felt a profound gratitude, not just for the food, but for Silas's capability, his grim determination to keep them alive. The fear of discovery seemed trivial now, overshadowed by the more immediate threat of starvation and the elements. Elias still hadn't shed the disguise, but it felt less like a necessity and more like a habit, a layer that had become part of his identity. The climax came not from human threat, but from the land itself. A blizzard, unlike any Silas had seen in years, descended upon the cabin. The wind shrieked like a banshee, battering the walls, threatening to tear the roof off. Snow piled drifts against the door and windows, plunging the cabin into near darkness. The fire, their lifeline, began to dwindle as their woodpile, despite their efforts, was lower than it should have been. Outside was impossible. Inside, the cold began its slow, insidious creep. They huddled by the fire, wrapped in every blanket they possessed. The silence between them was no longer comfortable, but tense, filled with the roar of the storm. Silas fed the fire sparingly, his face etched with worry Elias had never seen before. In the close confines of the cabin, with the world reduced to the terrifying sounds of the storm, the pretense felt fragile, pointless. Elias looked at Silas, his face illuminated by the firelight, rugged and weary. He had saved Elias's life, sheltered him, shared his meager resources, all without question or judgment. A particularly violent gust rattled the cabin, and something shifted outside. The wind howled louder, finding a new entry point. A shutter, loosened by days of relentless wind and snow, had given way. Cold air blasted into the room, bringing with it a shower of snow. The fire sputtered. They had to fix it or they would freeze. "The shutter!" Elias yelled over the wind, pointing. Silas nodded grimly. It was a two-person job, dangerous in the storm. He grabbed rope, preparing to go outside. Elias didn't hesitate. Survival instinct, honed by months of hardship, kicked in. He grabbed another piece of rope, knowing he had to help. As they bundled up, pulling on every available layer, Elias looked at Silas. The moment felt charged, the unspoken finally surfacing in the face of shared peril. "Silas," Elias said, voice firm despite the fear. He stopped. What was there to say that wasn't already known? Silas met his gaze, his pale eyes steady. He saw not a boy, not a girl, but a person capable and ready. The disguise felt thin, irrelevant. "Later," Silas said, his voice rough but clear. "Let's just live through this." It wasn't an evasion. It was an acceptance. In the face of the storm's fury, who Elias was beneath the clothes mattered less than what he could do, standing there, ready to face the wind and snow alongside Silas. They worked together, lashed to the cabin by ropes, battling the wind that tore at them with vicious strength. It was a brutal, desperate struggle, hands numb, bodies battered by the elements. Silas directed, his voice sharp and clear over the storm's roar. Elias, smaller but quicker, managed to secure the rope and maneuver the heavy plank Silas passed him into place. Snow whipped at their faces, blinding them. But they worked as one, a single unit against the chaos. There was no time for fear, only action, coordination, survival. Finally, painstakingly, the shutter was secured. The gap closed against the biting wind and snow. They stumbled back inside, collapsing by the fire, gasping for breath, bodies trembling with cold and exhaustion. The cabin felt blessedly warm now, the quiet roar of the fire a welcome contrast to the storm's fury. They sat there for a long time, the silence between them different than before, no longer filled with unspoken tension, but with the quiet weight of shared survival. Hours later, when the worst of the blizzard had passed, leaving only the mournful howl of the wind and the soft hiss of falling snow, Elias looked at Silas. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty. He began to unbutton the rough wool shirt, then the layers beneath, revealing the simpler, more feminine clothes he wore underneath the disguise. Silas watched, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. When Elias finally pulled the last layer off, sitting there in a plain dress by the firelight, he met Silas's gaze directly. His name was not Elias. It was Alara. The name felt strange on his tongue after so long, fragile and real. He waited for Silas's reaction, for the questions, for the judgment he had fled from. Silas finally spoke, his voice low. Alara, just the name. He didn't ask why, didn't demand an explanation for the deception. He simply accepted it, accepted her. The following days were a revelation. The pretense was gone. Alara moved about the cabin differently, felt the freedom of being seen, truly seen, by this quiet, stoic man. Silas didn't treat her differently. He didn't suddenly become garrulous or overtly gentle. He was still Silas, shaped by the harsh land. But there was a subtle shift in his demeanor towards her. A quiet attentiveness, a shared glance that held understanding. They talked more now, not much, but enough. She told him, in fragments, about the circumstances that had led her to flee, to disguise herself, to seek anonymity in the wilderness. He listened, offering no pity, only the steady weight of his presence. He, in turn, shared little of his own past, his life a closed book, but the listening, the acceptance, felt like a reciprocal act of trust. Spring arrived slowly, hesitantly, melting the deep snow, turning the landscape from white to mud to a tentative green. Life returned to the prairie. Their supplies were desperately low, but they had survived. Their partnership, forged in silence and shared hardship, had seen them through. Alara was no longer the terrified, vulnerable girl who had huddled against a rock face. She was strong, capable, her hands calloused, her spirit tempered by the winter's ordeal. She was no longer hiding, no longer running. She was simply here. One evening, sitting outside as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, Silas looked out at the vast, empty space. "Hard land," he murmured, a rare utterance. Alara looked at him, then at the land that had nearly broken her, that had tested them both so fiercely. It was hard, yes, cruel even, but it was also beautiful in its own stark way, demanding respect and resilience. She thought of the girl she had been, lost and afraid, and the woman she had become, standing on this land, beside this man who had offered her refuge without asking for anything in return. "It is," Alara replied, her voice quiet but firm. "But it lets you live. If you're strong enough, it wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about living, about resilience, about finding strength in the face of despair." Silas looked at her then, and for the first time, Alara saw a hint of something in his pale eyes that might have been a smile, or perhaps just a deep, quiet acknowledgement. They had faced the storm, the hunger, the cold, and the silent, private fears. They had survived. The future on the prairie was uncertain, always demanding. But they would face it together now, two figures against the vast horizon, bound not by words or promises, but by the quiet, enduring strength of shared survival and the dignity found in simply facing the dawn.